Okay, good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. To those joining us on Zoom and to those joining us on Facebook, my name is Alex Havasey. I'm Vice President of the Humanist Community. Okay, the Humanist Community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular, reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you've not done so already. Membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. That's humanist plural. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website, humanist.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate to our organization, again, at our website, www.humanist.org. Today, Judge Mary Beth O'Connor will talk about her journey from junkie to judge, recovering without God. She'll describe how she responded when her rehab ordered her to comply with a God-based approach to Alcoholics Anonymous, and how she built a secular recovery program. She'll then provide an overview of substance use disorders and treatment options. She'll explain the benefits of building a personalized recovery program and the obstacles to doing so. She'll provide recovery resources and take questions. Mary Beth is a board member for the She Recovers Foundation and a director for Life-Ring Secular Recovery. She regularly speaks on behalf of these organizations and about multiple and secular paths to recovery. She had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, I Beat Addiction Without God, and one in Recovering Today, How I Attained 28 Years of Sobriety by Rejecting My Rehab's order to submit to AA. Professionally, 6 years into recovery, Mary Beth attended Berkeley Law School. She worked at a large firm, then litigated class actions for the federal government. In 2014, she was appointed a federal administrative law judge. She retired from that position in 2020. Mary Beth?
All right. So hello. Good to meet you. Yes, I'm Mary Beth O'Connor. And my book is called From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. But the original subtitle was Recovery Without God, because 30% of the book is about how I built a secular recovery program. So my story in brief is basically that child abuse led to childhood addiction. My mother was not bonded or connected to me at all. In fact, I was left for 6 months at a nunnery when I was first born, and later for 3 years with my great-grandmother. And she could be, violent. She was certainly loud and aggressive. But the bigger problem arose when she married my stepfather when I was 9, who was very violent with her. He was verbally, emotionally, physically, sexually violent with me. And it was really the kind of household where you never knew what was going to trigger it. So it wasn't like it was every day. It was just that you never knew. So it was a very stressful. I developed a lot of techniques to try to reduce the violence. Like I taught my sister how to put the dishes away from the dishwasher, one dish at a time, so they didn't clack, things along those lines. But that only reduced the frequency. I really had no control over the situation. So for me, it really sort of created a vulnerability, seek relief in all the wrong places. And when I was 12, I picked up my first drug, which was alcohol. And it was Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine, which some people may recognize. We drank it actually out of Flintstones glasses that used to hold grape jelly. I mean, that's, how young we were in the basement. But for me, it was really a revelation. It was a very freeing feeling. I felt light. I remember I was laying on the floor giggling about things. It was an emotional release. And that caught my attention. And so I really started looking for opportunities to drink pretty much from the beginning. I would try to either take alcohol, even steal from my stepfather, which was risky. But also I looked older, and the drinking age was 18 in New Jersey when I was growing up. So alcohol was pretty readily available to me. And then I soon thereafter also picked up pot, cannabis, or you might call it now, or weed. And I incorporated that used to excess. Then we were doing pills, a lot of it's stealing from medicine cabinets, but there were downers that were sold, and occasionally black beauties, which were an amphetamine. But the bigger collapse for me started when I was 16, when I found what became my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine. And I was using regularly at 16, and I started shooting meth at 17 years old. I was in full bore addiction when I graduated from high school. So, I had lost a lot of weight. I was really in pretty bad shape at high school graduation, but I did manage to go to college. I came to California. I ended up graduating from Berkeley. And for the first 3.5 years, I did better. And I emphasize better. I mostly used alcohol. I used some pills, sometimes Coke, mostly on the weekend. Occasionally it would roll into the week. But I had a life-threatening multi-assailant rape in college, and I moved in with a violent boyfriend, and that was it. I just couldn't even keep the, modicum of control that I had. And I started using meth again in January of my senior year of college. And I used until I was 32. So it was a really long run. I say I worked my way down the corporate ladder during those 10 years. Because I couldn't hold a job because I was using, and every job was less money and less responsibility, and I held it for less time. I was really emotionally debilitated. I was exhausted, beyond exhausted. I was starting to have physical problems at 32 years old. My partner was done with me and was ready to throw me out. And so sort of as a last resort, I said, well, what if I go to rehab? What if I go to rehab? And so I did. I went into a women's program in Oakland, and it was a longer term program, 90-day minimum commitments, although I ended up staying for 5 months. And on my first day, so every day in my rehab, they would do a step study. 12 steps are Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the anonymouses are 12 steps. And so what they would do is they would read a step, and then they would either read the AA Big Book or the NA text about that step, and then there would be a conversation. And on my first day, it so happened they were doing step 3, which is made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the God of my understanding. And so they were talking about it, and I'm a good student. I raised my hand. What about me? I'm an atheist. And they were vehement and adamant that I had to find a higher power or I was not going to be able to stay sober, that it was impossible. There was one and only one way to attain sobriety, and that was the 12-step way. And I would raise questions, and they would tell me that I was running on self-will, and that I had to also agree I was powerless and turn my will and my life over, none of which I was going to do. And so it was a real problem. For one thing, I'm looking backward at 20 years of poor decision-making. So it's hard to trust my own judgment against the experts. But if I would have believed them, I would have given up because I couldn't do it. There was no way for me to suddenly find a higher power. And so what I decided to do was to keep my mind and my ears open and look for the parts that I thought would be helpful to me and just ignore everything else. And so that's what I did. I mean, they taught us useful things in rehab, some of the science of substance use disorder, how to recognize and handle triggers. They recommended group support. We had some counseling. And I read all of the Big Book and all of the NA text, and I looked for parts that I could apply. So for example, 12 Steps has this mantra, 1 day at a time. I found that helpful. If I was having a craving day, I'd say, I'm not deciding for tomorrow, but for today, I'm not going to use. I found some benefit from hearing people tell their stories at 12-step meetings, because sometimes their story was very much like mine. And now it's 6 months or a year or 2 years later, and they have a job and they're paying down their debt and they look healthy. And it started to help me believe that if they could achieve sobriety, then maybe I could too. I looked back at the powerless step, which I didn't agree with. You have to, and so what I decided was, well, I can agree that Mary Beth is powerless to moderate. Like there is no moderating for me. That third step, turn my will and my life over. I took another look and I decided I could use it as a lesson in limited control, that I should try to make efforts to achieve my goals, but I couldn't always control the outcome. So I did a lot of things like that to try to figure out how to make it work. But even with all that, I really vacillated between some hope that I could recover like everybody else and really fear when faced with a universal consensus that I could not. So when I got home, I decided to actually do some research and see, is it really true that there are no other options? And I emphasize, this is 1994. Okay, there's no Google. Okay, so I went to the library and lo and behold, I found options. And so the first one that I found was Women for Sobriety, which is the first modern secular peer support recovery program. And Women for Sobriety focuses, and I'll tell you a little more about it, but it's a self-empowerment based program. And in a Women for Sobriety meeting, when you introduce yourself, you don't say, I'm Mary Beth and I'm an addict the way you do in a 12-step meeting. The introduction is, I'm Mary Beth and I'm a competent woman. And that really felt empowering to me. That felt like it was meeting me where I was. In the beginning, I didn't mind saying I'm Mary Beth and I'm an addict over and over and over. I thought I sort of needed to beat it in my brain. But by now it's 8 months later and I wasn't finding it helpful. I thought I was announcing it like it was the most important part of me when it wasn't. I was announcing it like it was, the core of who I was when it wasn't. And so to find a new introduction was really a light. And also just to find even one option was like a weight off my shoulders. Like, okay, other people have done it a different way. And then I also found Rational Recovery, which at the time focused on relapse prevention. And they taught that your self-will, your free will, your decisions were sufficient for you to get recovery. Not that self-will was a negative, but that it was a positive. Rational recovery still exists a little, but it's mostly evolved into smart recovery. And then I also found Secular Organization for Sobriety, and they focused on self-empowerment and rational decision-making, and SOS also still exists a little, but mostly it's evolved into Life-Ring Secular Recovery, which broke off in '95 and is the much larger surviving entity, and I'm on the board for Life-Ring. And so I actually continued to do how I had started. I read everything. I mean, I had to write to PO boxes with a check to get books and call 800 numbers. And I read everything and I went to meetings for all of them. And I continued to do how I'd started. I pooled the ideas that I thought would be useful. And and that's what I did. I incorporated the ideas and I synthesized them. And today we might call that a hybrid or a patchwork plan. But at the time that I did it, I didn't know anyone else who did. So that's what I based my recovery on, and I've been sober since January of '94. I also had to do a lot of personal work. I had horrible, as my husband will tell you, interpersonal skills. I had a lot of fear. I was always waiting for the world to explode because of the trauma. And I had PTSD and I didn't know it. And I had severe anxiety and I didn't know it. And so I had to address all those things together. And so I did, individual therapy. I later did a therapy group of women with trauma histories, which was really enlightening. Meds for a while. My husband and I did couples counseling. So it was really trying to attack everything. And that is why the subtitle is One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, because it was really necessary that I do both. My legal career. So I actually went to Berkeley Law right out of college. But remember, I had started using meth again in January of my senior year. And so by the time I got there, I couldn't do it. I was missing weeks at a time. I knew I would never finish. I knew I was going to fail out. And so I withdrew. And this was a real painful loss for me, that I had a top 10 law school and I had to give it up because of my addiction. And I knew that's why it was. When I got home out of rehab, and so 32, I have a Berkeley degree and actually good grades, but I had a horrible resume. And so I wasn't ready to sort of leap into a job that my education theoretically would have qualified me for. And so I did what I was ready for. And my first job was part-time, low-level, temporary admin job. Because for me to get up every day and get ready and get there on time and stay all the hours I was supposed to be there and do a good job and go back at the next day and do it again and do it again. I was 32 years old and I had never done it in my life. And so I really needed the time to sort of get that habit going, to get into the rhythm of that before I was ready for more. And then my second job was a permanent, full-time, mid-level administrative job. And then I worked at a larger company as a supervisor and got a promotion. And then at 6.5 years sober, I applied to go to law school, which was, I had a lot of fear around that. I was afraid of explaining what had happened last time and, I'm going to get rejected. And so I applied. Berkeley did not take me back. But I got into Hastings, which is a good law school. It's not a top 10, but it's a very good law school. And then I was number 3 in my class of 400 at Hastings. And then Berkeley did take me back. And I actually did end up graduating from Berkeley Law in 2003. And so that was a real sort of cherry on the top of my recovery to have gotten that back. I did do, as in the intro, big law for a while. I did government work on class actions. And then in 2014, I was appointed a federal administrative law judge. And I took I emphasized early retirement in 2020. And now what I do is basically I do sort of part-time recovery advocacy. I am on the board of Life Ring Secular Recovery. I'm on the board of She Recovers Foundation. My book, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, just came out. I have essays. I've had essays out. You guys, I think, particularly would be interested in the 2 that were mentioned. I Beat Addiction Without God in the Wall Street Journal, and How I Attained 28 Years of Sobriety by Rejecting the AA Order in Recovery Today. But I've had other essays as well. And I'm a speaker and I'm an advocate. And mostly what I talk about is multiple paths to recovery, because I don't feel that enough people know about it. And also, the families often don't know about it. So sometimes if the, let's say the Life Ring member chooses Life Ring, the family members only heard of AA and they are afraid of them doing something else. They think it's like, some easy way out, or it's not really serious. And so by my making it more well-known that, for example, I have 29 years of sobriety and I was a judge and I did it secular, it's part of the goal is to reassure family members that it's a viable and valid option. So that's me. So I'm going to now give you a little bit of substance use information. The definition has evolved over time. So I mix up saying addiction and substance use disorder because substance use disorder is a lot to say every time. But that is the modern terminology. It's a person with a substance use disorder rather than addiction or addict. So the National Institute of Drug Addiction currently defines SUD as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking. And here's the real modern critical part. Continued use despite harmful consequences and long-lasting changes in the brain. And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, has a similar definition: recurrent use of alcohol and or other drugs. And I will remind you, alcohol is a drug. It counts as a drug. It's a liquid, legal drug, but it's actually a very vicious drug and takes down, more people die of alcohol every year, even currently, than with the opioid overdose rate. More people still die from alcohol. So it's recurrent use of alcohol or other drugs, clinically significant impairment. So the focus is on impairment, including health problems, disability, and failure to meet major responsibilities at school, work, or home. So we no longer talk about substance use disorder as in how many drinks a week did you have, or how many days a month do you use, or anything. The focus is on what is the impact on your life. Are there negative consequences that happen and yet you keep on using? If that's the situation, that's a strong indicator that you have a substance use disorder. The other thing I'll say is that you hear a lot of substance use disorder addiction is a disease, and there is an argument for that. And many people believe it, and it's in the current government definitions, but it's debatable. And so there's a current way of looking at it that it's actually a learning disorder. This is in Maya Salovitz's Unbroken Brain is an example of that argument, or that it's really a natural habit sort of gone amok. And Mark Lewis's book, Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, is an example of that approach, that way of thinking. The other thing I'll say is that currently now we look at substance use disorder on a spectrum. So it's not a light switch. And so we say, is it mild, moderate, or severe? So you can fall anywhere on that spectrum and qualify. The other important change since I've been sober is that hitting bottom is no longer recommended. Okay, it's not necessary and it's dangerous. People die waiting to hit bottom. And it was always retrospective. What was bottom? Bottom was always, I now have a stable sobriety, and looking backward, where was my low point? It's not like it's a objective criteria that you meet or don't. It's always, for me, what was my lowest point looking back now that I have a consistent sobriety? But people do die waiting to have their bottom be bad enough, and that's a problem. And they also can have serious and sometimes irreversible health consequences, right? Alcohol really kills the liver. A lot of people need liver transplants. They have cirrhosis. Cancer, you're much higher risk of cancer with drinking and certain other drugs. So waiting for this fantasy bottom that's bad enough to get treatment, it's just creating more damage. The earlier someone can find a way to intervene, to disrupt their substance use disorder, the better off they are. Fewer years lost, usually less destruction, hopefully still have something of a support system. So there's just less to repair. I mean, don't get me wrong. I had a low bottom. I have 29 years. It's possible, but it's so much better. I love seeing people come in the rooms and they still have a job or they're still married, and living with their spouse. I mean, it's so much better if we can get them in earlier. The other idea I want to share is that stopping or reducing drugs, including alcohol, can be beneficial even if you don't meet the substance use definition. This is why now we have dry January and things along those lines. And the reason is, for example, even at moderate use, alcohol has negative health effects. A notable increased cancer risk, breast cancer in particular for women. It impacts the liver, it can impact the heart. But there's also, people can be making risky decisions under the influence, even if they don't qualify for having a substance use disorder. Are they driving under the influence? Are you even being a passenger with somebody else who's under the influence? Are you regretting sexual decisions or other choices that you made under the influence? Do you have hangovers, interfering with productivity, or just with living your best life? Are you using alcohol or other drugs to avoid dealing with feelings, when it would really be better to do an investigation and figure out what's going on and address it? Are you using it to avoid a problematic life situation? Maybe you're unhappy with your partner or your job and you use alcohol or other drugs to deal with that stress. That works in the short run, but in the long run, it's going to keep on going unless you actually address the problem. All right, I can't hold the mic and drink this. So there are a lot of treatment options if someone has a substance use disorder, and some of the decision might be around, are they mild or moderate or severe on that scale? That's one of the factors. But there is inpatient treatment. If people use insurance, a lot of times they will only pay for 28 or 30 days, which is not ideal. Well, it's not ideal for some, but that's often what insurance covers. And it certainly it can help. There's also what's called intensive outpatient treatment. And so many people that need to keep working or feel they're capable of continuing in their job. IOP usually is 2 or 3 evenings a week for a couple of hours. And then they might have some extra, some peer support meetings on top of that. But it lets people hold their job and still live with their family when they're going through treatment. There are currently an increasing number of doctors and therapists with substance use disorder expertise. There's not enough, but the numbers are growing. And then there are recovery coaches. A recovery coach can sort of be someone that a person engages with on a weekly or more frequent basis to set goals, to talk about struggles, to get ideas. And then there's medication-assisted treatment. So for alcohol and opiates, we actually have very good medication-assisted treatment for both, not for stimulants. For stimulants, there's some drugs in study, but we don't have anything that's passed through the larger studies yet. But for alcohol and drugs, there is medication-assisted treatment that significantly increases the odds of maintaining abstinence or having fewer episodes or shorter episodes of relapse. But the problem is that access. So currently the data shows that only around 10% of the people who could benefit from MAT gets it. The other problem is that for some people in 12 steps, this is not official 12-step philosophy, but a lot of the people on the ground are against MAT and people are discouraged. And that's problematic because the data is very strong. All right, so now I'm going to go through the peer support options. And this is where the AA thing came. So most everyone's heard of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, again, all the anonymouses. And here are some of the key ideas. Higher power. You must believe in a higher power. They are clear. It says God in a lot of the steps and a lot of the book, but if you go, they'll say it doesn't have to be God. It just has to be any higher power. But it does have to be something outside of yourself and something that you are going to turn your will and your life over to. So it's not that you have to believe, you have to turn over your will and your life. And that is related to the powerless idea. And then there's 12 steps is very specific. You're supposed to do the steps in order. Everyone is supposed to do this exact program. Now, don't get me wrong. I support 12 steps when it's a good fit for people. Some people find the higher power part, a help, that they're faith-based thought anyway, but also it's more structured. And a lot of people like the structure. And also it's just in more communities. And so if people want to have face-to-face meetings, in-person meetings, rather than just online, in a number of communities, you would have to go to 12 steps. There's nothing else there. You can access everything else online, but 12 steps has meetings in almost every community in America, so it's more available. And then there's LifeRing Secular Recovery. I'm on the board for LifeRing. And some of our basic ideas, we call it the 3 S's: sobriety, secularity, self-help, and a personal recovery plan. So for sobriety, for example, that means clean and sober from drugs, except medically indicated and taken as prescribed. So that is really important. If you're on medication-assisted treatment or any other drug that your doctor says you need and you take it, emphasize as prescribed, that counts as sober in LifeRing, and that is an important factor. The secularity is really out of respect for all faiths and none, there's no religion in meetings. But many members have personal, religious, or spiritual beliefs, and we have no opinion about that. It's just not necessary for recovery, and it's not a part of our program or our philosophy. And then we have personal recovery plan. And that is the idea that we are all different, and what works for one person may not work for me. And so my plan and your plan may not look the same. And that's not only okay, that's desirable. Let's figure out what plan will work for you. And then SMART recovery is another option. They have a cognitive behavioral therapy approach. SMART includes other types of behavioral disorders in the same meeting, like gambling or eating, which some people like and some people don't. So all of the groups have their pros and cons. Everyone, read up and find the one that looks right for you. She Recovers Foundation is another option. I'm on the board for She Recovers. She Recovers is not just for substance use disorder. It includes recovery from trauma, mental health, eating disorders, cutting, self-harm, other types of behavioral disorders, grief, anything. And the reason for that is that most women and men as well that come into the recovery space that have a substance use disorder, usually they have something else going on, mental health, trauma, some other challenge that's going on. And so when She Recovers, you can talk about it all in one space. You don't have to talk about your substance use disorder in this meeting and your eating disorder in that meeting and your trauma history over there. There is still Women for Sobriety. The first program I found that was secular, and they focus on self-empowerment and what they call the 4 C's, that you are a capable, caring, competent, and compassionate woman. And they focus a lot on positive reinforcement. There are 13 statements, and they believe that, you release the past and you focus on building yourself up, that's going to be the way to stay sober. And there's Recovery Dharma. Recovery Dharma is Buddhist based. They focus on inner wisdom and an individual journey. And there are others, and there are none. Many people actually get sober not using any peer support group. The data shows that. it's important to find what's the right fit. But if someone says, I'm going to try it without, and you're the family or friend, I say, let them try it, see what happens, see how it works. And I'll say this, sometimes newbies say to me, how do I know which one is right for me? But I really believe, seeing as today there is Google, okay, you can go, if someone goes online and looks even at these 6 that I'm presenting, 1 or 2, and they read the philosophy, and the meeting formats can be very different as well. The meeting format of LifeRing versus 12 steps is very different. I really think if they read up on them, 1 or 2 are going to call their name. 1 or 2 are going to feel like they're philosophically consistent with their belief system, and it's going to feel like my people are in that meeting. Go there, go there. So the personal recovery plan, which is what I did, because I pulled ideas from multiple sources and synthesized them. A lot of the non-12-step programs do emphasize that. And those groups that I showed, you don't even have to do just one. You can mix and match. And in LifeRing, for example, there's a lot of people do just LifeRing, but many members also do 12 steps or also do SMART or She Recovers. And in LifeRing, that's 100% okay, because it's your plan. And if you think your best recovery success will come from mixing programs, we support that. And so that's an important idea. I really do say to newbies, if somebody tells you you have to sign an exclusive agreement with this peer support group, that's a red flag. Self-empowered recovery is about designing your own program. It's about making the choices for your recovery that you think will work for you. And it doesn't mean alone. So self-empowered can mean, this is my peer support group. I go to 1 LifeRing meeting a week and 1 She Recovers meeting a week. That's part of my personal recovery plan. That's self-empowered decision. Self-empowerment also includes asking for help when needed. If somebody thinks they need professional help or peer support help or friends and family help, that's a self-empowered decision. You are looking at the situation and deciding what you need and reaching out. So it doesn't mean alone. There are actually a lot of benefits from building your own program, and one of them is really self-knowledge. So what you're really doing is an analysis. Who am I? Where am I? Where do I want to go? And how do I think I can get there? And you're thinking about it, and you're analyzing it in detail. And LifeRing, for example, has a workbook that's very detailed if people want to use it to help them build. But that analysis can create a stronger sense of ownership, because you are deciding on the plan, you're deciding what you think is right for you. And that can help with resilience. If people are at risk of getting pushed off track or do get pushed off track, having gone through the process of thinking about it and thinking of their choices and making decisions can help. The other part of a personal recovery plan is that the plan changes over time. And so it has to be adjusted. So someone in recovery typically will not have the same plan on day 1 and at 6 months and at a year. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that hopefully they've achieved some of their initial goals. So now they can set new goals, either sort of in the same area of life or start attacking some other part of life. Another possibility is that sometimes when we try to carry out a goal, we realize it actually isn't a good goal for me, or it's not as high a priority as I thought. And so you can put it aside and focus on something else. Sometimes when you try to carry out a goal, even though you tried your best to do the analysis, as you try to carry it out, you realize you hadn't factored everything in. And so now you have to redo the analysis with the factor that you had missed. And sometimes people have a really good plan and they just don't do it. And so it's really about looking at, why am I standing in my own way? Why am I not carrying out my plan? So for anyone concerned about making a choice of something other than 12 steps, not that I think that concern would be high in this room, but there actually was a study in 2018. It's called the Peer Alternative Study. And they compared the efficacy of AA, LifeRing, Women for Sobriety, and SMART. And she found that basically they're all equally effective. And so there were some differences, like the secular options tend to have a higher average education, higher financial average, and the 12 steps had a stronger religious affiliation. Members of 12-step alternatives also showed higher levels of satisfaction and cohesion, but generally speaking, the odds of success were the same. And that is probably because of the peer support side. I mean, they're doing further studies, but that is most likely why. And so what's important, and what I really advocate for, is telling people of their options so they can find the right fit and thereby increase their odds of success. So that is always my goal. I don't even care if they pick Lifeline just because I'm on the board. I just want them to know so that they can find the best fit. And the other part of it is that people do, if they have a dual diagnosis, they do it better if they do simultaneous mental health treatment. And as you guys probably know, right, religious nuns, US is increasingly secular, and the nuns include atheists, agnostics, humanists, free thinkers, and others. The studies I've seen show 21 to 32%, although sometimes those numbers include the unaffiliated who believe in God or higher power, but they're unaffiliated. The other change has been that the religious nuns are more distributed throughout the country than they used to be. They're not as much just in the larger cities. So there's a larger number of religious nuns in suburbs and in more rural areas than there used to be. And then there's also, with religious nuns, the diversity of age. There's a greater diversity of age, a greater diversity of ethnicity, a greater socioeconomic diversity among the religious nuns than there used to be. All right, so now I'll tell you about the obstacles to multiple pathways. So here, what happened basically is that 12 steps was sort of first in modern times, right? And they really had a really good marketer. Her name was Marty Mann, and she got them embedded in the medical profession. And I mean, there was positives to that. They got it categorized as a disease. And the goal of that was to take away the stigma of someone having it. So there were, I don't want to make it sound like it was all negative or nefarious. It wasn't. But the reality is that a lot of treatment programs are 12-step exclusive. And so they either explicitly 12-step exclusive, which mine was, or it's implicit. There's a lot of assumption about 12-step ideology that's embedded in many of the treatment programs. So for example, you might hear outside of the idea of 12 steps, just in your regular treatment classes in rehab, that you have to have a higher power or a spiritual awakening in order to be sober. That's not true, and that's really a 12-step idea. But they don't say this is a 12-step idea. They say it as if it's a foundational fact, as if it's just true. They also often emphasize that powerless idea, that you have to agree you're powerless in order to recover. It's just not true. And they really, some of them really focus a lot on one size fits all. So a lot of facilities offer one plan and you are expected to fit yourself in the plan rather than them fitting to you. And there's ideas like, like I was told that my best thinking had gotten me there. In other words, don't think, just do what we say. And I will say that in my defense, I did tell them, I promise it wasn't my best thinking. Okay. But I got a lot of things like that. Don't challenge us, I was supposed to just accept it and apply it. And that's problematic for a lot of people. And I'll give you an example. Kaiser in the Bay Area, in one location, is very open to multiple paths. They teach about it. They have meetings in the facility of SMART and LifeRing and Women for Sobriety and other groups in the facility. It's treated fairly equally. But then there's a Kaiser in another place, and the guy's very 12-step. And he requires people to have a sponsor to graduate so they can get on to the next level of care, because it's like in a 3-tiered, first you do this part, and then you graduate and you go to this other, part of the program, and then to another. Well, only 12 steps has sponsors. Nobody else has sponsors, and yet he mandates it. And so it's created problems for our members to try to figure out how to comply in a way that he'll sign off so that they can move forward in their program. But I will say that overall, it has improved in the time that I've been sober. More facilities are looking at the data. More facilities, even if they don't have the meetings for the alternatives, they will tell their clients about it. Even if the only meeting that comes into the facility is 12 steps, more facilities will at least give them the list and maybe explain the philosophy of the different options. More facilities are not don't have as much of the embedded 12-step ideology in their treatment plan as used to. It's improved, but it's still a significant problem. So if I had a family member who was not a higher power person, I would definitely ask them if they support multiple pathways, and I would ask them specifically, what does that mean? What exactly do they do to support multiple pathways? And the other thing I mentioned is an obstacle is the friends and family pushback. And so, as I said, a lot of friends and family of people so the friends and family have had this family member that they love or friend who struggled with substance use disorder for years and is finally going into treatment and going to peer support. And then they mentioned they're going to go to LifeRing or some other group that they never heard of. And that, can create fear about, are they serious about getting sober? Are they serious about their plan? And so I actually hold a monthly meeting for LifeRing for the friends and family of our members to explain what LifeRing is. And the reason I do that is specifically to help reassure them that it's a viable option. And I give them the Sarah Seymour study, and I say 29 years and I was a judge and I did it this way, and all of those things to help them feel more comfortable that if their family member chooses an alternative, that they should let that happen, as long as the person is, being serious about it. I wouldn't worry. There are other obstacles to multiple pathways, and one of them is the courts. So there are decisions that say specifically that have looked at AA and NA, the 12 steps, and they categorize it as religion because it requires a higher power. It requires a belief in an external power that's intervening in your life. And the Humanist, Appignati Humanist Legal Center has handled cases that have related to this, but it still happens. For example, in drug diversion or other probation or parole, where people have to go to peer support meetings as a requirement of their drug diversion or as a requirement of their probation, a lot of times the sign-in sheet, it literally says AA/NA at top. It doesn't say peer support attendance, it says AA/NA. And so people have to, if they want to do an alternative, they have to ask or push back. And these people are sort of vulnerable to the system, right? They're on probation. They're at the sort of mercy of their probation officer, and it's hard to push hard. When people get sentenced, where you go into AA meetings, or, if you mention something else that the judge never heard of, it could be a problem. Good time sentence reduction. So we had a LifeRing member, and he was in jail, and they were giving good time credits. In other words, reducing people's sentence for attending 12-step meetings, and they would not give them credit for attending LifeRing and participating in LifeRing. And so these kind of problems arise all the time. Probation, parole. It can be a problem in family law if one of the parents has a substance use disorder, and that's an issue in custody or visitation. A lot of times they're required to go to AA or NA, not just any peer support meeting. It's an ongoing problem, and our members come to us about it regularly. All right. So this is resources. If people want to get information, SAMHSA, which I mentioned earlier on the definition side, has a lot of information about substance use disorder. They have information on a variety of programs, the various peer support and other programs. They have a treatment provider list by location. So you can go in and put your zip code in and get a list of treatment providers for substance use disorder. They have an evidence-based practices toolkit, which would be something you might want to look at so that you could actually have questions for any facility you're looking at to see if they're actually evidence-based. And then they have a lot of research and data. And then there's also NIH, and they really focus on the science of substance use disorder and how to gather more information. And then in California, there's the Department of Public Health Substance and Addiction Prevention Branch, and they have a lot of information, resources, links, an 800 number. They also have harm reduction information. So one of the big current modern pushes is an expansion of understanding of the benefits of harm reduction. And so harm reduction is basically anything that improves the health of someone who is still using substances. So harm reduction can include moderation. Harm reduction can include things like where someone, let's say they have a alcohol use disorder and a cannabis use disorder. Sometimes people think, which is hurting me the worst? And I want to give that up first. I'm going to give up alcohol first, and then later I'll look at giving up the cannabis. Harm reduction, some people categorize medication-assisted treatment as harm reduction, although I just view it as treatment, but okay, it's harm reduction. Syringe services. Syringe services is harm reduction. When I used the needle exchange in San Francisco for the last few years of my addiction, it wasn't legal, but it was like a third party, and the police would just drive by. We would line up in a row before a van, and we with our used needles, and they would give you clean ones. You would trade them in, and the police would go by. And the reason was because of HIV and AIDS, that they viewed it as important to reduce the spread in the community, because of course sharing needles is one way. Safe injection sites or overdose prevention centers. I had an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer about safe injection sites. And that's a hot topic in San Francisco, is going back and forth about it. New York has too. There's strong data from Canada and Europe about safe injection sites. But so to me, harm reduction is a multiple. Harm reduction eventually leads to abstinence. Many people that do harm reduction will eventually get sober. And for example, at the syringe services or the overdose prevention centers, the odds of that person going into treatment who aren't participating in those programs. But the other reality is, even if they don't get sober, harm reduction is better for them, and it's actually better for us, because with harm reduction, people aren't going to the ER as often, which actually costs a fortune for a lot of major cities in America. The person has fewer long-term consequences, physical consequences, and if they do get sober, they have less to deal with. So there's a variety of harm reduction techniques, and there's a variety of benefits that can come from harm reduction. These are some of the local resources. San Francisco has the Department of Public Health, Behavioral Health, and Santa Clara County, and every county, generally speaking, has something called either public health or behavioral health, where they have local resources for substance use disorder treatment and other information. All the counties in California do. All right, and that's the end of my presentation, but I'll take questions. So you can reach me multiple ways. You can email me at this, but you can also you can message me through my website, and I always answer every message. And it's, the website's junkietojudge.com. My Twitter is @MaryBethO_. And then my book is available, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, available on Amazon and all the usual sites. And I have them today. And if you buy it today, I will sign it for you. But that's really what I wanted to say, but I definitely wanted to leave time for Q&A if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
Yeah, Alfred.
What do you think of the San Francisco's policies of giving free drug paraphernalia to any addict that goes there?
Support. I mean, that's what the needle exchange was, although when I did it, it wasn't the city doing it, it was a third party. But the reality, look, the data shows, let's say for the needle, now they call it syringe services, because they don't necessarily make you turn in used needles, because a lot of times people can't keep track, like if they're unhoused. But the data shows that it doesn't increase drug use. It actually keeps, needles and things off of the street, being disposed of on the street. And it's a health benefit to the individual. In San Francisco, for example, just giving people clean needles will, again, reduce the types of diseases that'll cost more in medical. So even if whether you care for the individual or where your tax dollars are going, or both, it's beneficial. I know it can be hard it's counterintuitive to think about people giving them things like needles to use, but it's really if you look at it from a public health standpoint, it's just got very strong data as to the overall benefit to the individual and to the society as a group.
I was going to say, I've been here a long time, and back in the 70s, there was a feature where if you had drugs, you'd send it into a chem lab with your own special number, call them up, and they'd tell you what's in it. They'd also make announcements on the radio about what's out there, what's dangerous, what's not. In all fairness, sometimes the DJs were a little too eloquent about the lack of harm, but eventually the government shut all that down. I wonder if any chance of getting that back, or if it's as necessary.
So right now, obviously, the overdose rate in America, we hit an all-time high in 2022. We lost over 120,000 lives to overdose. About 20% were stimulants, and the rest were opioids. That doesn't count alcohol. Alcohol separate, because it's not overdose. Alcohol deaths in 2022 were around 140,000. And so because fentanyl, so what's happened is that fentanyl has gotten embedded in the opiate supply. So people no longer know what they're buying. It was always historically, almost every overdose death was somebody with a long-term substance use disorder, but it's not true anymore. A lot of casual users, including teenagers and 20-somethings, are dying because the fentanyl's in the drug. So there are fentanyl test strips, which are unfortunately illegal in a lot of places. And so there's been a big push to try to get the fentanyl drug test strips to be more legal. It tells you whether there's fentanyl in it, but it doesn't tell you what percentage, and what percentage matters. And so now there are some facilities, some labs where you can send a little sample in, or in New York, there's one I think you can walk up to, and they will test and they will tell you what percentage of fentanyl is in your drug. But so there's that. And there is also a push to notify the communities when there's a big increase. So there's a new drug, I forget the pronunciation, I think it's xylazine, that is being used in opiates, and it actually gives people, like they get rashes and, sure. And it gives them sores and rashes and other problems. And so the community groups are trying to announce when they're finding it when they test. So they're testing samples, of what's around the community, and trying to sort of forewarn people that this is here now. It's in our supply now, and you need to be careful about that. So those are the things that I know about that remind me of what you were talking about.
Randy.
Oh, hi. If I understood correctly, you were suggesting that SUD was, as I understood it, a symptom as opposed to any kind of cause, be it alcohol or this or that, and probably more a reflection or a outcome of unfortunate circumstances, whatever they might be.
So the data shows that if someone has a significant trauma history like I did, especially a repeat trauma history, I was 4 to 6 times as likely to develop a substance use disorder. And the other flip side of that is that approximately 75 to 80% of people who have a substance use disorder, and I'm including alcohol every time I say substance use disorder, about 75 to 80% have a trauma history. So it's not everyone, it's just a very high percentage. But you can also develop a substance use disorder just through overuse, or because, the genetic predisposition is debatable, but often in families with a substance use in their family often have other environmental, behavioral, family dynamic problems that would lead someone to increased odds. So it's not 100% trauma based, but it's very high trauma connection.
Okay. The other point I just wanted you mentioned that there's a debate somewhat regarding amphetamines as being addictive. Maybe psychologically, but not physically addictive. Because my own experience in the 60s, we used to get amphetamine diet pills, right?
Right.
There was a doctor who supplied half the taxi drivers in Albany. And we'd smoke that with grass, and it gave you the energy to experience a wider experience, okay? On the upside, the reason I bring that up, all drugs have pros and cons, goods and bads. I think amphetamine had a large part to do with being on the dean's list in my senior year, and it got me through the CPA exams.
So I actually didn't say that there's a debate about amphetamines, but I will address it. So when I was brought up, it was said, you don't have withdrawal from amphetamines because you're not sick like you are from an opiate. You have a psychological, but now that they do brain scans, it depends on what you mean by physical, your brain has withdrawal from amphetamines. Okay. So if you count your brain as part of your body, there is actually withdrawal. But if you use it occasionally, whether it's opiates or amphetamines, you're not going to have withdrawals because of occasional use, right? You withdraw when you've used it enough that your body and brain has become adapted to. You don't go through withdrawal I've done heroin. I never had a heroin withdrawal because I hardly ever did did it. So the withdrawal, whether it's physical or your brain recovering, is not going to happen if you use it intermittently or occasionally. It's only going to happen if you develop a dependence on it and a substance use disorder.
I'll get to you. I just want to say there's a line I remember in an index to a book by who is it? The guy who wrote Naked Lunch. But anyway, Burroughs. He was talking about the effect of narcotics and so on. He was talking about recovering from withdrawal, and mentioned things that would help. And he added, any painkiller will reduce the effects of withdrawal. And then he said the effects are the result is, the conclusion is obvious. Any painkiller is addictive. I was just wondering what your reaction to that comment was.
I mean, there are things they can do today for withdrawal, like rapid, detox, but there's pros and cons. But I mean, well, look, if I was coming off of heroin and there was anything that would make it easier, yeah. I would try it, because heroin withdrawal is miserable, right? But so is alcohol. And people die from alcohol withdrawal. Alcohol withdrawal can cause seizures. Alcohol withdrawal is vicious. If people have had long-standing alcohol use disorder, they need professional oversight for detox. You don't just stop alcohol. Yes, I mean, there are things they can do. I guess that might be one of them. But the main thing is if you have that long-standing of a substance use disorder, including alcohol, detox, professionally supervised detox is really recommended for the first step.
Dana?
Thank you. Hi. Yeah, a long time ago, I was a social worker, and I started in '89 at the county, and I worked there for about 7 years for the juvenile court. And all of our cases were as a result of substance abuse, basically. And so we've had these waves of different drugs.
Right.
First, it was PCP, as I recall. Then it was cocaine and all the cocaine babies. And then it was methamphetamines. And it was just really, and I did hear that if people have a long time amphetamine use, that they do have physical consequences, like losing their teeth and their hair and things. Is that true?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things to that. One is, yes, that one drug will become more predominant in the area, and then it'll wash to another. But it can also depend what's currently readily available. Most available can depend on where you are in the country, based on local sourcing and things like that. But it does tend to be in waves. It's just really switching one thing for another. As far as meth, yes, people do have, every one of my teeth are either crowned or filled. Every single one. So it does deteriorate on your teeth. Part of that's hygiene, but part of that's the nature of the chemical. But the other thing that they've learned about meth, which I didn't know when I was using it, meth can create psychotic symptoms when you're using it, including because you're up for days, right? I mean, even if somebody off of meth stayed up for 3 or 4 days, they might have, hallucinations. But meth in particular is known for making people paranoid or to have hallucinations.
Excuse me.
Okay.
Yeah.
What they have learned as they've looked more at the data is that for some people, it can take months for the psychotic, or longer, for the psychotic symptoms to go away. And for, I think it's around 5 to 10% of the people that have long-term meth use, they never fully recover from the psychotic. Some of them will still have some level, maybe not as bad, but some level of ongoing symptoms. So yeah, meth is vicious. They're all vicious in their own way. but meth is very hard physically. Yeah, I was having physical problems by the time I quit. I've been using meth, for 15 years, and my body was showing it.
Two questions, and you can take them both as you like. One is, you haven't mentioned tobacco at all, and that's a drug that has its problems and supposedly like the most difficult to withdraw from. The other is you mentioned the success rates is about equal across all programs. What is that success rate?
So of course, alcohol is addictive, and it is, a huge killer, right? But it's just the substance use recovery programs usually don't directly address it. There's other techniques to address alcohol, and I'm not actually an expert in that, but Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, tobacco. And I mean, I know for most of us in recovery, a lot of us smoked when we were using, and I quit. I had smoked cigarettes from when I was like 9 until 2 years sober. And I finally, quit my cigarettes. So for many people in substance use recovery, eventually they have to face their tobacco issue and see whether they can recover. But it is hard. As far as the overall rates of success. So a lot of times what you see is data that says only 5% of success rate for substance use recovery, but that's really about each effort, each individual effort. And so, for example, I used 3 times in my first 5 months, and then I got 29 years. So did I fail 3 times? Or for me, I really viewed it as I was sort of rolling up to the skill set to enable me to stay sober longer. So it depends on how you define it. But there is some data showing that in the bigger picture, about 75% of the people who try to get recovery will eventually attain long-term sobriety. The other data point that I love is that once people get 5 years sober, their odds of ever relapsing again are only 15%. And that's not that much higher than the general population's odds of developing a substance use disorder. And so a lot of it's about time. I just had 29 years this month, and what I posted on Facebook and Twitter, what I believe is going from 28 to 29 is not the hard part, okay? Like, it's just not the hard part. It's those first couple years where your brain has to get reset, where you're developing the new positive habits to override the drug using habits, the compulsive habits, and however you categorize it. I view it as a brain disorder is the terminology I use, but they have now brain scans. For example, I've seen brain scans on meth when you're using at 90 days, 6 months, a year, 2 years. It's not until 2+ years where your brain scan starts to look like like the average brain scan. It takes a long time to fully recover, and that's the vulnerability period. Now, don't get me wrong, 15% is still a significant number of people do struggle later at some point. But then should really be our focus on how long are we going to let it last? Let's not have judgment or shame around that. Let's just have, oh, wow, like many others, something happened in my life, or I got surprised and I slipped, and I need to try to figure out how to get back on track right away. And the problem can be when people are using that loss of time as people can feel ashamed about having lost their time instead of really just focusing on, let me get back. But those are the data points that I know.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Sure.
Excellent talk. I have a question about the brain scan. Will you be able to share some of the pictures of those brain scan and show where it affects, like in the drug situation versus alcohol? And you also mentioned that the progression, the improvement, the recovery, as the patient goes through, you also do the brain scan. Can you reflect, can you talk about it a little bit more? I'm just interested in the brain part of the issues. Thank you.
I mean, there are definitely science-based books, like the one by Mark Lewis. He's a doctor. You might want to look. The brain scan that I can remember seeing was in the HBO addiction book, and they had like a mini series around it on HBO. And I specifically remember seeing the brain scan pictures there. So you might want to look at. But if you Google, brain recovery and substance use disorder or something, I would bet you find them. But the other thing I'll say is that, look, there are some sort of lower level differences between being a heroin addict or a stimulant addict or an opiate addict or a stimulant addict or an alcoholic. In the bigger picture, basically your brain doesn't really know the difference that much. There's the differences in the details slightly, but overall it's the same process that is causing you to develop the substance use disorder. Overall, it's the same brain process. So they're not going to look that different from drug, but I know that addiction book did have brain scans of different drugs I specifically remember, but I'm sure you can find it online. But the truth is, I mean, I know from my own experience that, at a certain point, hopefully the struggle is over, right? I mean, I never really struggled with my substance use disorder after 3 years, but I also don't forget about it. Like, I don't take it casually. I don't play around the edges. Okay. My husband will tell you, I don't eat tiramisu because they soak it in alcohol. And he'll say to me, children eat tiramisu, Mary Beth, children eat tiramisu, but I don't. And so I try to not forget. I remember the chaos. I remember the obsession. I remember the misery. I don't ever want to go back there, but I don't fight it. It's not something I have to pay attention to on a regular basis. And that is a beautiful place to be. And that is where most people can eventually get. So, and that's what I want for all of them, is to be able to reach that place.
Okay, thank you. It's been a wonderful talk.